Hey, Nomar Slevik here. I hope everybody is having a wonderful Anomicon 2024. Shout out to Ryan Sprague and shout out to all of the other presenters. For me, I am a writer, a storyteller, a researcher, and an investigator. I'm also a quasi-documentarian, and for this presentation, I'm bringing to you 4 mini documentaries. It's 4 stories from the New England area for what I'm calling New England Encounters. This first story takes us back to the 1970s, where 2 people came across something truly odd and unusual. This is the Surrey light bulb. It was around 10 p.m. when Mrs. Dickinson was seated inside her enclosed porch. This overlooked Patton Bay and the Hancock County Bar Harbor Airport beyond. She routinely observed the lights of approaching small-engine aircraft, and this night was no different. At this moment, her friend arrived, parked his car, and walked into the enclosed porch to join her. Before he could even speak to Mrs. Dickinson, he yelped at the sight of something strange outside, just on the other side of the porch. Dickinson hadn't noticed whatever made her friend yell, and she jumped up to face him after being startled so severely. The friends observed a small, translucent vessel that appeared to resemble a light bulb. Dickinson said, quote, "It was just big enough for one occupant and shaped like an antique Mazda Edison electric light bulb. I know, I have a couple," end quote. And since the aircraft was transparent, they were able to see the occupant inside of it. It was a small creature, estimated to be about 3 to 4 feet in height, and its head was oblong and described as, quote, "the layered, bandaged look of a wasp's nest," end quote. It sat on what appeared to be a white or pale blue box, and its right hand extended forward onto some sort of control panel. It had large black eyes, but no observable mouth, nose, or ears. Its left arm, quote, sort of hung at its side, and its feet hardly touched the floor, similar to a child in a too large chair, end quote. As the craft slowly glided by them, the creature turned its head mechanically and stared directly at Dickinson. The unusual movement was described as, quote, "a porcelain doll, swivel-headed," end quote. Before she could even react to the stare down, the craft disappeared before their eyes. Not knowing what else to do, they retired to the living room to discuss what had just transpired. She thought the light bulb-shaped object could have been a scout craft from a larger vessel that possibly loomed somewhere higher above them. They planned to check out the yard the following morning to see if there was any sign of the object having been there. When morning arrived, they checked the immediate area and found nothing unusual. They even ventured onto the property next door to have a look. The neighbor stepped outside and asked what they were doing. They told them of the incident and asked if they had seen anything. The neighbor hadn't and appeared frightened at the story. Dickinson decided not to mention it to anyone else after that. She added, quote, "I knew my world would never again be the same. There was a whole universe full of new activities in which I had become involved. Now I had seen a number of lovely spacecraft, but as long as they were way up in the sky, they did not concern me. This, however, was another matter," end quote. What an unusual vessel and creature to encounter, especially so close to your home. Moving on to the next story. A gentleman in 2015 traveled north to visit their parents. They went outside one evening and they encountered something unlike anything I've ever heard before. This is the unlikely story of the static in the sky. I hope you enjoy. It was a beautiful night in June of 2015 when a man named Sean visited his parents in the unincorporated village of Crossville, Maine. There is very little in the way of light pollution in this area of the state, and Sean had situated himself on the front lawn to smoke a joint and watch the stars. Before it was lit, a bright flash of light from somewhere above him caught his eye. He told me later, quote, "I rolled said joint and went out to stargaze, as I usually do because of the lack of light pollution up there. It's magnificent. You can see so many things you can't down here in Portland. Anyway, as I came out the front door, there was a flash of light in the sky. I didn't catch it visually, just the afterglow. When I looked up, I thought, cool, heat lightning, but noticed there were 0 clouds in the sky. Thought that was a bit weird." End quote. While odd, he continued on and grabbed a patio chair so he could sit comfortably. As he did this, another flash occurred behind him. This time, it was accompanied by an odd sound. He turned as quickly as he could, but missed it. He said, quote, "I turned and it was dissipating. It was more of a weird glow and a strange hiss. It was oddly pitched, almost like it was chords. Super hard to explain, but I've come close to replicating it on my synthesizers." End quote. At this point, he abandoned the chair and the joint and was now staring up at the sky. He began to question whether it was heat lightning or something else entirely. He didn't have to wait long. A moment later, another flash appeared, and it seemed to be a more dazzling display than the previous flashes. The hissing sound seemed to emanate from the flash. The visual aftermath was disconcerting to Sean. The sky above him harbored what appeared to be a miles-wide television-like square with a static disturbance inside of it. In his own words, quote, "What I saw was a gigantic square in the sky that looked like a TV, little squiggles of little moving lines. I was immediately struck with adrenaline." End quote. As he watched the manifestation above him, the square began to narrow and reduce itself. The sinuous white lines seemed to consolidate into the square's center. All the while, the hissing sound grew louder and louder. Quote, "I knew what I was seeing wasn't normal. After the square shrunk to a certain point, it formed into a circle, creating a bright center. The hissing became louder, the pitch of the hiss changed, and the low hum became more apparent to me, to the point I could almost feel it in the air. The white parts of the static square started coalescing into the center, creating a circle that I can only compare to a coronal ring during an eclipse. Once it reached the point where the square was fading, as the center circle became brighter, the pitch almost became a pressure in my ears." End quote. A moment later, everything was silent. The atmosphere changed around Sean, and he experienced a total vacancy of sound. Suddenly, the circle light pulsated, made a strange sound, and then shot off at an unbelievable speed until it disappeared. He stood in the silence of the night. The static in the sky was gone, and now he was alone. He eventually walked inside, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. The following morning, he was still thinking about the previous night's events. He wanted to know more and decided to walk into the field where he thought the anomaly hovered. He wasn't quite sure what he was looking for other than some sort of evidence or validation that would prove to him that what he had witnessed was real. After walking for a little while, he found that evidence. He told me, quote, About a mile or so out, the hay was splayed flat, and there was a giant checkmark-like burn. It was huge. I took a photo, but it was on a phone that had been stolen while I was at work. I never uploaded it. I regret that." End quote. Sean still thinks about his encounter, and I can't blame him. What a wonderful, terrifying, and fascinating spectacle to behold. I'm sure he'll be watching the sky for quite some time, and I'm confident he will keep us in the loop if he sees anything else. In talking to Sean, we both wish he had that picture of that check mark. The picture that I found for the documentary is just a stock footage piece of, burnt wheatgrass, but just imagine what that looked like in person with what he found. Amazing. And hopefully he'll keep us posted if he sees anything else. This next story is exactly why I love doing what I do. I was at an author's fair trying to sell my wares, trying to make a living, and another vendor came up to my booth and was just looking at my books, and we said our hellos, and they were flipping through one of my books, and they just casually shared a really strange encounter. And I feel fortunate to have met this person and their family, and it's truly unique and certainly a first for me. And I really hope you enjoy this one. I was a vendor at an author's fair in December of 2022. The event was created and coordinated by main author Christopher Packard. After setup and patrons arriving, a fellow vendor named Marianne, who works for a local bookstore, stopped by my table to peruse my work. After a moment of flipping through the pages of one of my books, she casually said to me, quote, "My son was abducted," end quote. After a brief exchange, I asked her if I could contact her a few days after the fair to discuss the incident. She agreed. As life gets in the way sometimes, it took us a little while to get together and discuss her son's abduction. It was a late Friday afternoon on the 10th of February 2023 when I pulled into her driveway. A big, beautiful tabby cat was sitting on their front deck, and I had every intention of patting the gorgeous creature, but it scurried off at the sight of me. Marianne greeted me at the door and introduced me to her wife Wendy and their children. I was quickly charmed by their New Englander-style home, and they escorted me to the dining room as we made small talk. "Let's just start from the beginning," I said. Wendy and Marianne grabbed their phones, and I saw them begin to scroll. Marianne said, quote, "We both went back to our phones, back to what actually happened because we messaged someone the story. So we have the original fresh take, which is maybe better than ours now," end quote. Wendy spoke next and shared the original message in question. "Names have been changed." Quote, "So this is to my friend Denise. I wrote, so not kidding about Alex being abducted by aliens last week. He relayed the whole story to our neighbor Percy last night. Pretty unsettling. It happened during the day. He had gone upstairs to play with Tanya. And then a giant bug came and took him away, but didn't take Tanya. It then bit him on the inside of his stomach, and then it brought him back. They didn't say anything to him," end quote. A child's imagination could be at play here, but it seemed oddly specific. I asked about the circumstances in which their son told them what happened. Wendy said they were sitting together when out of the blue he stated, quote, "Mommy, something strange happened to me yesterday," end quote. After listening to the story, a concerned Wendy told Marianne. In their son's description, he said the bug looked like a big ant, and when the creature returned him, he said it stared at him as it slowly backed away. Once it hit the threshold of the room, it turned and walked to the stairs. Before it descended, it looked at the child one last time, and then finally went down the stairs, seemingly leaving the house. Marianne said, quote, "That's a weird story. Had he woken up and said it, all right, kids have dreams and dreams are weird, but that was really weird," end quote. I agreed and asked if they had more conversations about the big ant. Quote, "Very little," Marianne answered. "I showed him some pictures of aliens, but we didn't use that word. He didn't have any reaction to them," end quote. The boy never seemed scared or verbalized fearing what happened. It didn't seem to affect him, though Marianne and Wendy noticed a peculiar quirk. In their son's drawings and art, he would refer to people as humans. Marianne shared, quote, "I've heard him say it before, in the context of a picture. Rather than saying like a boy or a girl or a mom or a dad, he would say, 'These are the trees and this is the sun, and these are the humans.' It's a weird word to refer to yourself or other people," end quote. I asked about other possible sightings or incidents inside or outside the home. Both of them shared that they had seen odd lights in the sky every once in a while. There is a flight path over their town, which they're used to, and recognize the strange lights that they have seen deviated from that. None of the sightings were overtly mysterious, just out-of-place lights in the sky. I then inquired about paranormal activity inside the home. They've all experienced that too. Marianne told me, quote, "All the kids have seen an old man. He hides behind a tree outside and also rides in the car. He wears a blue suit. And Tanya, more than anybody, has seen people in her bedroom, people in the corner, people in the bed with her," end quote. I was listening intently while the children played in another room, and every once in a while, one of them would come in and sit on one of their mom's laps and then dart out of the room again. They're all cute, and you can tell they are loved. Despite the weirdness associated with their son's insect intruder, everyone, including the spirits, seemed to be getting along. Our talk by this point seemed to be winding down. They had a Valentine's dance they needed to get ready for, and I didn't want to hold them up any longer. I thanked them for their time and departed soon after. We've kept in touch since then, and so far there have been no more abductions. A quick follow-up to that. In the same town, I had gotten my tires replaced at a local store. And while I was waiting for them to, change everything over, I was talking to the owner of the business, and we got to talking about what I do for a living. And he proceeded to share with me that one morning, while he was drinking his morning coffee and working out in his garage, so it was about 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and it was already light out, which is good, he started to hear something out in the distance, and to him it sounded like motorcycles, but it was coming from like his backyard and the wood line. So he's standing there waiting for whatever's making that sound to come into view, and when they do, he said he saw these two insect-like figures riding on what looked like motorcycles, but without wheels. They were like hover cycles, almost like they were out of Star Wars or something. And this is a gentleman who never thinks about UFOs or otherworldly matters or anything paranormal. But when he told me that, he said that he was convinced that what he saw was real, and he couldn't believe it. And for me, just coming off, because this was just a few weeks later after talking to Marianne and her family, I mean, to me, I'm like, is there some sort of infestation in Winterport, Maine, with these insect-like entities, It's like, it was incredibly coincidental, synchronistic, and amazing to hear his account. And that's all he saw. They just kind of went by in the field behind his house in the tree line, and they just kept on going on their hover motorcycles. So strange, so odd. And he was like, well, okay, and takes a sip of his coffee and goes back into the garage. This is wild. But let's move on to the last story. This one is military in nature and takes place on a massive SAC military base that was active up until 1994 in northern Maine. This is the story of UFOs at Loring Air Force Base. Situated on over 8,000 acres, Loring Air Force Base was a USAF installation located in Aroostook County, Maine, near Limestone and Caribou. Loring's history as one of Maine's most beloved Air Force bases has long outlived its closure, which occurred in 1994. The Historic American Engineering Record wrote, quote, "Loring AFB demonstrates the military, technological, and economic complexity of the Cold War. Once one of the most heavily armed of the Strategic Air Command bases, it stands as a visible representation of the policies that shaped the political, economic, and military history of the world in the last half-century." End quote. Construction of the base began in 1947. Soon after, strange objects were captured on radar. Quote, "Numerous radar devices within Loring tracked 40 unidentified targets at 10:30 a.m. on the 6th of December, 1950. Because there were so many objects, it was thought that enemy bombers were en route via Europe toward the northeast coast of the United States. The objects were last tracked at 32,000 feet and then vanished. The White House was notified at 10:32 a.m. and President Truman discussed the objects in a meeting with British Prime Minister Clement Attlee." End quote. Numerous encounters continued for over 2 decades, which seemed to culminate over 3 nights in October of 1975. On the evening of October 27th, Sergeant Clifton W. Blakesley and Staff Sergeants William J. Long and Denny Lewis, who were assigned to the 42nd Security Police Squadron, were all on duty at the munitions storage area at Loring. It was a typical evening monitoring base activity when the stillness of the early evening was interrupted at 7:45 p.m. The men observed a red light floating about 300 feet above the base, which violated the restricted airspace over Loring. Reporting the light immediately, Staff Sergeant Lewis noted that he could not see any doors or windows on the object, nor any propellers or engines which would keep the object in the air. The next evening, on the 28th, at precisely 7:45 p.m. again, Staff Sergeant Lewis and Sergeants Long and Blakesley observed another unidentified flying object, but this time on radar about 3 miles away. Soon after, the 3 men then visually observed the UFO, after which Staff Sergeant Lewis notified the base command. Around that same time, a captain and a B-52 air commander observed a white light in the sky. It appeared to be hovering over the runway, and when a helicopter approached the object, it appeared to either take off rapidly or its light blinked out. Not long after that, another UFO was sighted over the base. This was first acknowledged by Sergeant Stephen Eichner and Sergeant Jones, and was described as, quote, "a silent orange and red object shaped like an elongated football. It was hovering over the runway about 4 car lengths long. It was solid, with no doors or windows, and with no visible propellers or engines," end quote. It was observed hovering, moving about, and then it disappeared. Moments later, it was spotted over the runway about 150 feet off the ground. As numerous base personnel looked on in awe, a plan was devised with Maine State Police and APs to confront the craft from the ground. Personnel piled into a truck and drove down a road that paralleled the runway. Once they reached the turn to the nuclear weapons storage facility, the craft was approximately 300 feet in front of the truck and reportedly hovering only 5 feet off the ground. Sergeant Eichner later said, quote, "There were these waves in front of the object and all of the colors were blending together. The object was solid and we could not hear any noise coming from it." End quote. The APs and state police descended upon the runway and halted within 20 yards of the object. Before they could act in any meaningful way, the object disappeared. The following days were hectic at the base. A spokesperson was fielding media inquiries, and there was even rumors about the men in black removing log entries about the sightings and telling personnel not to speak with news outlets. Sightings persisted after these events, even after the closure of the base. In 2017, I traveled to Loring for myself and had my own experience. I first arrived on base on the 18th of April 2017 at around 1:30 p.m., and I was utterly unprepared for how desolate and abandoned the place would feel. Roadways were cracked from vegetation, and the former military housing area would be the perfect set piece for The Last of Us. Large hangars appeared fatigued and bled rust, and the runways were massive and felt like they were from another decade. I looked inside buildings through broken windows and took hundreds of pictures. I made sure to identify the areas I wanted to visit after dark and noted how to get back to them come nightfall. I left the base around 3:30 p.m. and got a bite to eat. I napped afterward and headed back out at around 9:30 p.m. I arrived back at Loring around 10 p.m. and was surprised at how different the base was at night. There were no lights. I don't know why I thought there would be, but the only signs of life were from the Loring Job Corps campus. But once I left the grounds, the base swallowed me completely. I was lost for about 20 minutes as I searched for Tower Road, which is how you get to the radar tower and runways. I planned to hang out on the runway for a while, as it had an unobstructed view of the sky. After utilizing Google Maps, I was able to find my way. I parked awkwardly in what I considered to be the closest area to where the UFO was spotted over the runway in 1975. I shut off my headlights and the engine and watched the skies. I did this for over an hour, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I then drove over to the Arch hangar, located directly across Tower Road. This thing is a behemoth, and in the darkness, it felt like it was 300 feet tall. It's actually 90. I parked near its entrance and used the light from my full spectrum camera screen to light my way. I took some pictures and had a brief EVP session by the open door, but again, I heard nothing and saw nothing out of the ordinary. I then got back into my vehicle and decided to drive to the parking lot of the radar tower to watch the skies from that vantage point. Once parked, my head was on a swivel. Just after midnight, as I looked into the sky, I noticed a light. It was below the cloud layer, which meant it was not a celestial object. At that moment, I could only gawk at the object like anyone else would. Being an investigator was the furthest thing from my mind. I had all my gear in the passenger seat and didn't even grab it. I finally realized I was holding my cell phone, and I accessed the camera and hit record. As I was recording, I decided that I wanted to move underneath the object. I shifted into drive and let my foot off the gas, and I rolled about 5 feet. This was when the light suddenly flashed and swirled, and then it blinked out. I was mad at myself for moving the vehicle and not utilizing my gear. Despite this, when I played back the footage, I found I'd capture the entire series of events. I stayed at Loring for another 2 hours before departing. I drove back to the runways, visited an abandoned building, and skulked about the property without further incident. I finally left and arrived back in my hotel around 3 a.m. I then began analyzing the footage. It wasn't all that compelling, so I took a screenshot of the light, zoomed in, and played with the lighting and colors. The light had an implied structure, but it wasn't easy to discern any actual detail. It truly was an unidentified flying object. I finally drifted off to sleep and eventually left the area in the late morning. With all the reports of unusual sightings for over 7 decades, I felt as though the base and what occupies its airspace accepted me that night. I was allowed a glimpse and will remember that encounter for the rest of my life. That wraps up my presentation for Anomicon 2024. I hope you enjoyed the 4 stories, and I hope you'll continue to watch all the other presenters and share your feedback, and so Ryan can keep doing this every year. Again, shout out to Ryan. Thank you for having me be a part of this. I really appreciate it. All of these stories came from my book, UFOs Over Maine, 10th Anniversary Edition. I'm putting the cover on the screen right now, and it is available anywhere you get your books. It's available on my online store, slevikstore.company.site, the Green Hand Bookshop, greenhandbookshop.com, and it's also available on Amazon, Kindle, and Apple Books. Thank you so much. I'm Nomar Slevik. Enjoy the rest of your Anomicon experience.